But I think that what Netanyahu did was very happy about was that in a certain way, Trump legitimized the idea of ethnic cleansing. It used to be the case in the past where the Israelis themselves hardly ever talked about ethnic cleansing because, again, it's a morally reprehensible strategy. But now it's out in the open in Israel in a big way. And that is due in part to what Trump said and his comments about turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. I think he was probably surprised, and I don't think he's really that wild about the idea in the sense that in Trump's telling of the story, the United States ends up controlling Gaza, not Israel. And what the Israelis want is they want to control Gaza and, of course, control the West Bank, and they want to get rid of the Palestinians. So I think that who was surprised and unhappy from that point of view. Well, there's no question that outside of Israel, this proposal has been seen as outlandish and ridiculous and not realizable. And there are even a good number of people inside Israel and, of course, inside the United States who understand that it is morally bankrupt and unworkable. So I think there's hardly any doubt that this is not going to work. There's no way any president of the United States can break from what is the basic U.S. foreign policy toward Israel, which is unconditional support for whatever Israel does. The Israel lobby is surely the most powerful lobby in the history of the United States. And there's no way any president can wander off the reservation and pursue a policy that is seen as fundamentally at odds with what Israel wants. So you should expect Trump to basically act like Joe Biden. And if Kamala Harris had been elected, she'd act like Biden and the way Trump is acting. Well, there would be a tremendous uproar in this country, and the lobby would go to work to do everything it could to force Trump to change his position. And the lobby in the past has been very effective. And President Trump surely understands this. He's not interested in picking a fight with Israel. He has too many other fights to pick. And if he had only one fight to pick and it had to do with Middle East policy, he's a person who may be willing to challenge the lobby and challenge Israel in a serious way. But as things stand, he's fighting a multi-front war, and he is behaving in very aggressive ways on each of those fronts. And the last thing he needs is a fight with Israel and then getting into a fight with the lobby as a result. The Israelis are not going to sell it. It's a preposterous statement. The Israelis are not going to sell Gaza to us. As I said before, the Israelis don't want the Americans to occupy Gaza and turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. The Israelis want Gaza for themselves, just like they want the West Bank for themselves. They don't want the Americans getting in the way. The fact is the Israelis are settling the West Bank. They have a huge number of settlers in the West Bank. And many people argue that the most interesting question about the West Bank and Donald Trump is whether or not he will recognize the legal annexation of the West Bank by Israel. It's just de facto at this point in time, as is the case with Gaza. But a lot of Israelis would like to see Israel be allowed to annex the West Bank. And the question is, will Trump do that? I think most people just don't understand how powerful the lobby is. And I think most people are afraid to admit that the lobby is as powerful as it is because they know they'll be accused of being an anti-Semite. I mean, when Steve Walt and I wrote the original article and then the book where we described the power of the lobby, and by the way, we were just describing what was the tip of the iceberg, by the way, we were roundly attacked for being anti-Semites, just the way it operates. And nobody wants to be called an anti-Semite. So people dance around the whole subject of the lobby. And the end result is you do have a certain sense that most people don't fully understand just how powerful the lobby is. And I think what's happening here is that the Trump administration wants to have good relations with the Russians and, in effect, peel the Russians away from the Chinese. I think that the Trump administration is trying to do what the Nixon administration did when it changed our relationship with China, because we didn't like the idea of China and the Soviet Union being the best of friends and us being on the other side of the fence. We brought the Chinese to our side of the fence. I think in this case, what Trump and company are trying to do is bring the Russians over to our side of the fence and put some daylight. Doesn't mean that the Russians and the Americans are going to be bosom buddies or allies or anything like that. But I think that the Trump administration wants to put some daylight between China and Russia, wants to get us out of Europe as much as possible and let us concentrate on East Asia. I think the first tranche of expansion, major tranche, was 99 when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were brought in. And then the second big tranche was in 2004 when the Baltic states, Romania, Slovenia, Slovakia, and Bulgaria were brought in. We got away with those, and the Russians could live with those two tranches of expansion. But it was the April 2008 decision that was fatal. If they had stopped after the 2004 decision, and they had actually then gone on to work out some sort of meaningful security relationship with the Russians to cover those areas that weren't covered by NATO, and that was not a lot of territory, by the way. Just a couple quick points. One is, it is important to emphasize that when the Cold War came to an end and the Soviets were pulling out of Eastern Europe, they wanted the United States to remain in Europe. They saw us as a pacifier, and they thought it was especially important for us to stay because Germany was Germany, and they liked the idea that Germany was integrated into an alliance that was run by the Americans. But in the 90s, and I remember it very well, this phrase popped up regarding NATO, and it was expand or die. And the idea was that if NATO didn't expand, it would more or less wither on the vine. And what's happened here is NATO looks like it's expanding and dying. Yeah. And just to take it one step further, you and I believe have a very peaceful situation in Eastern Europe today, simply because I don't think the Russians had either the intentions or the capabilities to overrun Ukraine, Belarus, Eastern Europe, whatever, right? The Russians were just interested in getting their own house in order. And Putin, despite the picture that most people have of him in their heads in the West, is not a highly aggressive individual. And in fact, if anything, he gets beat up in social media inside Russia for not being aggressive enough. We're not waging the war aggressively enough in Ukraine. So I really think if you had not had that April 2008 decision, we would not be in this catastrophic situation, certainly catastrophic from Ukraine's point of view that we're in. You want to remember that NATO expansion was packaged together with two other strategies. One was EU expansion, and the other were the color revolutions. And the color revolutions are usually thought of in terms of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the Rose Revolution in Georgia. But we were interested in fomenting a color revolution inside of Russia. When Michael McFaul was the US ambassador to Moscow, he was in a very important way pushing for a color revolution inside of Russia. And as you can understand, this really spooked the Russians. So it was not just NATO expansion, it was also EU expansion and the possibility of a color revolution inside of Moscow that really contributed to this disastrous policy outcome. Hegseth made it very clear yesterday that the United States is not going to provide a security guarantee to Ukraine, that it's the responsibility of the Ukrainians, or excuse me, it's the responsibility of the Europeans and other non-Europeans to provide security for Ukraine moving forward. And under no circumstances can NATO do that. So you see what's happening here, and this is my earlier point, is that the Trump administration is basically telling the Europeans, you're responsible for Ukraine. We're walking away. And if we're walking away from Ukraine, we're also walking away from Europe. We're walking away from NATO. Now, I'm overstating the case, but there is a large element of truth in what I'm saying here. But the point is, there's going to be no security guarantee without the United States. You need the United States to have a security guarantee. In fact, you need NATO to have some sort of security guarantee. And what Hegseth is saying, I mean, you want to understand how radical those comments were. He's basically saying, we're washing our hands of Ukraine. Right. We're washing our hands of Europe. The fact is, and again, Hegseth made this clear, we are cutting a deal that reflects the hard realities of power, the power balance on the battlefield. Our side is losing. The Ukrainians and the West are losing to the Russians, and there's no way we can shift the balance. So what leverage do we have? Not a lot. And furthermore, Trump is not interested in playing hardball with the Russians. Trump is interested in having good relations with the Russians and basically getting out of Europe, or at least reducing our commitment to Europe in a fundamental way. And again, this is why Trump, in terms of yesterday's comments, or the Trump administration and yesterday, in terms of yesterday's comments, is acting in such a radical way. And Peskov said, Dmitry Peskov, who is the spokesman for the Russians on these issues, that what the Russians were interested in is not just an agreement on Ukraine. They want a broader agreement that deals with the security architecture in Europe overall. And I think from their point of view and from our point of view, this is a very smart idea, because the fact is there are a number of potential flashpoints outside of Ukraine that could blow up. This has been a very dangerous area. And we started this conflict in Ukraine by expanding NATO into Ukraine. And now we're paying the price. And we have upset all these delicate relationships that existed before the war started. And we have to think now, moving forward, about how we can come up with some sort of security architecture that makes sure that none of these flashpoints turn into another war. So what's happened here is, in effect, the Trump administration has said they are accepting the two key parameters that the Russians have put forth, which up to now, hardly anybody in the West has considered acceptable. Those are two of the key arguments that Hegseth laid out yesterday in Brussels. And it's very important to understand that those two arguments, or those 2 points that Hegseth made, dovetail with what were the two principles, or what are the two principal demands of the Russians for getting a peace agreement in Ukraine. In other words, the Russians have said Ukraine cannot be in NATO, number one. And number two, the West has to recognize that we have annexed Crimea and those 4 oblasts in the easternmost part of Ukraine. And what Hegseth said, and what Trump said yesterday, is that Ukraine is not going to be in NATO, number one. And number two, that the pre-2014 Ukrainian borders are never going to be seen again as the real borders of Ukraine. And Ukraine is going to have to accept the fact that it's going to lose a sizable chunk of territory. Now, how much territory the Americans are willing to allow the Russians to take was not spelled out. But by implication, it sounded like Hegseth was saying that the Russians can keep those 4 oblasts plus Crimea. I mean, we want to understand that what Trump and Hegseth did yesterday was to radically alter American foreign policy toward Russia and toward Ukraine. and they are cutting against the conventional wisdom. So you would expect John Bolton and the vast majority of security experts in the United States and in Western Europe or Eastern Europe as well to be beside themselves, to be enraged by what Trump and Hexit have done. And of course, the Ukrainians themselves are not going to be happy about this, to put it mildly. And you want to think about the Europeans in this context as well. There are really three players on our side: the Americans, and here we're talking about the Trump administration, the Europeans, both West and East Europeans, and then the Ukrainians. And the question you want to ask yourself is, are we really going to pay serious attention to what Ukraine wants and what Europe wants, or are we just going to negotiate a deal for ourselves? My second point is, on a previous show, Alexander, you said, and I found this very insightful, that one of the reasons that the Europeans are so subservient to the United States is because they fear that we'll leave, right? So they're just very good to us and do what we want. But what you're saying now, which of course is quite correct, is that's gotten them into real trouble because they've never acted independently in the past. Yeah. They're completely subservient to the United States. And now the United States wants to sort of cut their legs out from under them, and they really have nowhere to go. So all of this tells you they would have been much wiser in the past to have stood up to the United States. And if we go back to that April 2008 summit, if Angela Merkel and Sarkozy had really held the line, they had mightily resisted expanding NATO into Ukraine, in all likelihood, we wouldn't be talking about the problem of the United States leaving Europe at this juncture. But they didn't stand up to George W. Bush, and we know what happened after that. But I think, as we have said before, you don't get the deal that Putin wants, and then it's settled on the battlefield. And if it's settled on the battlefield, it's going to be much worse for NATO and much worse for Ukraine. They would be better off reaching some sort of agreement now. I'm not making the argument that that would be a good agreement from Ukraine's point of view. It's disastrous, but it's the least bad alternative at this point in time. We have pursued this remarkably foolish policy for so long now that we've put ourselves in a situation where the outcome for Ukraine can't be anything short of disastrous. But now we're asking the question, how disastrous? I don't want to be clear here. I'm not making the argument that settling this war on Putin's terms is good for Ukraine in the sense that they're getting a good deal. They're not getting a good deal. They're getting the least bad deal. And that's because the Ukrainians themselves, mainly in the form of Zelensky, and the Americans, mainly in the form of Joe Biden, have pursued this remarkably foolish policy and put us in this terrible situation, which is not easy to get out of. One is, I think you're absolutely right that the Russians don't trust us, and for very good reasons. Just looking at Donald Trump and how mercurial he is, he's the last person in the world you really want to trust. So I think what this tells you is that the Russians have a powerful incentive to conquer a lot of territory. Yeah. And they have a powerful incentive to weaken Ukraine as much as possible. And what this means is that it'll be harder to get a deal. The Russians are not going to be generous because it's not in their strategic interest to be generous when you're dealing with the United States of America, because the United States will take advantage of you. And they're in the driver's seat now on the battlefield. They've got the leverage. And what scares me is that it'll be impossible to get a deal, not just because of the Europeans and the Ukrainians resisting, but just because of what the territorial situation looks like and what the incentives are for Russia to really make Ukraine a dysfunctional rump state. And that'll bollocks up the works. I think that if you want a peace deal here, which Trump does, You simply have no choice but to accept the Russians' two principal demands. There's just no alternative here. As Alexander said, we have no cards to play. Uh, so if you want to end it, you send Pete Hegseth out, and he says there will be a neutral Ukraine, and we will recognize the fact that Russia has annexed certain pieces of territory. There'll be a debate over what that territory should be, but Trump really has no choice here. And if he doesn't accept those demands, the war is just going to go on. Putin has made that manifestly clear. All his lieutenants have made that manifestly clear. It's just pretty straightforward here. And if the Europeans and the Ukrainians, and there are a lot of people in the United States who are very unhappy with this deal, or with the direction that Trump is moving in as well. So let's assume they all prevail. Where does that leave us? If Trump fails to put together a deal and end this war, where does that leave us? Is the United States just going to walk away from Europe anyway? Are they going to say the Europeans won't cooperate with us, therefore let's let the Europeans deal with this problem? That's a possibility. I think the Hegseth speech in Brussels was really the key. I mean, obviously, President Trump is President Trump, and he's the man in charge. But they sent Hegseth out to deliver a very clear message. His words were carefully crafted. And I think his speech was truly remarkable in terms of what he said. And Hegseth said quite clearly that Ukraine is not going to be in NATO. And he said that Ukraine is not going to get back all of its territory. Now, he didn't stipulate exactly how much territory the United States would be willing to concede to the Russians, but I think it was implicit that those four oblasts plus Crimea are gone. Just to start, it's clear that the Russians have had two central demands since at least June 14th of this year. One is that Ukraine will be a genuinely neutral country. It won't be in NATO, either de jure or de facto. And number two, that the West and Ukraine will recognize the annexation of those four oblasts in the east of Ukraine, plus Crimea. So in a very important way, Hegseth, who is speaking for the administration, was saying that we accept the two principal demands that the Russians make. And that is a major turnaround. I certainly didn't expect it. And it opens the possibility that you'll get an agreement here. But to take this a step further, and Alexander, of course, was getting at this, there's another big dimension to this aside from Ukraine per se, and that is the Americans' relationship, or the United States' relationship with Europe. And basically, Hegseth said, if a security guarantee is given to Ukraine, it does not include the United States of America. The Europeans give that security guarantee. This is a quite remarkable statement, because we all know, and Zelensky said this, that a security guarantee from the Europeans without the United States and without NATO is meaningless, right? The Europeans can't provide for the security of Ukraine. So the glacial plates are moving here in a very important way. And just to add to this, you want to remember that President Trump has been in office for only about 3 weeks. 4 more years in front of him, right? And in terms of the U.S.-European relationship, he can fundamentally change that over the course of the next 4 years. But anyway, my second set of points have to do with whether or not we can actually realize a peace agreement. And Alexander concluded by saying that this is not clear, that this is a really dicey issue. And I agree with him. And let me tell you what I think are the two main problems. One is, at some point, Trump is going to have to bring the Europeans and the Ukrainians into the deal. It just can't be a U.S.-Russia deal. And I think the Ukrainians and the Europeans are going to be roadblocks. If you listen to Keir Starmer, he said today, to my utter amazement, that it's inevitable that Ukraine is going to be brought into NATO. This directly contradicts what the Trump administration is saying. It's a really sort of in your face statement. And that makes you wonder how the Europeans and the Americans and the Ukrainians are going to craft some sort of deal with the Russians that's acceptable to all four of those parties. So, in a very important way, you see that the United States is beginning to separate itself from Europe. And Hexeth, today, I believe, or yesterday in Warsaw, said that you want to understand that United States troops in Europe is not forever, or are not forever. This is another quite remarkable statement. No previous policymaker, certainly in the Biden administration, would have said anything like that. The other problem is it's going to take time to make this work. And in the meantime, the Russians are winning on the battlefield. And it is possible that all of this discourse over the past few days will sow further doubts in the minds of soldiers in the Ukrainian military, make them less willing to fight, and facilitate the breakdown of the Ukrainian army, in which case the Russians will conquer more territory. So I think that given the difficulty of putting an agreement together and the danger that the Russians will end up capturing a lot more territory, makes it even harder to see how this is all going to work out. And you want to think about what the implications are of the Russians conquering more territory. It's one thing to talk about signing a deal where the 4 oblasts plus Crimea are lost. It's another thing to talk about a situation where the Russians control 8 or 9 or 7, however many oblasts, a really big slice of the country, and getting the Russians to abandon those additional oblasts that they've conquered so that you can make the deal palatable to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans. It's going to be wickedly difficult.